and strong life. This is an amazing man, and he's done so much in the intellectual field. He doesn't want me to say it, but we have to say it.
Turn your mic on.
Oh, you're not hearing? I had a conversation with him yesterday, and he was telling us he was pulling out of, you know, in 1950 this cricketer from this place did that, and so on and so on. He's an absolutely amazing man. He has taught us so much, and I really want to pass the mic over to him now and to have him bring us up again.
Thank you, Chair. Please forgive my sniffles. I was in Jamaica a few days ago for one day, and I was so determined not to catch the chicken. Jamaicans call it chicken. I was so determined not to catch it that I was spraying myself with mosquito repellent all over my face and so on. So my sinuses are now activated.
Worse than chicken.
Again, good morning, everyone. This presentation seeks to perform two tasks. One is to add to what Hilary has said, and then to add my own views about where we can go and what we ought to consider. The first point I wish to make is that we, as a commission and in this conference, we are in a very complex situation, and I hope that everyone appreciates the complexity of this moment and the connection that we have put together, because we are just a very small part of the global reparatory justice movement. It is a global movement. It is taking place all over the world, and we in the CARICOM initiative, we are just a very small part of it. So we are not even at the center of it. We are a critical feeder into that movement, and most of you here have built that movement and continue to do so, and are leaders and conceptualizers of this global movement. The CARICOM intervention is a minor intervention into a large process. And understanding the relationship between the CARICOM initiative and the global movement, the geometry of that situation, I think we have to understand. And therefore, what we know is that there is a CARICOM Reparations Commission that has a mandate. That mandate is a part of the global mandate, and it is taking place with a rhythm that is quite different from the global rhythm. So my comments then will seek to interface my understanding between what the CARICOM initiative is seeking to do and what all of you have done and are doing on the global basis. Effectively, the CARICOM initiative merely sought to bring the governments of the Caribbean on board a train that had been traveling for 100 years. And that train has been moving for over 100 years. The governments have been reluctant to get on board. The governments, in many instances, were even in opposition to that movement, and have systematically used public resources to critique and to undermine that movement. What we have here at the moment is a realization that that political history was not sustainable, and therefore the CARICOM government have come on board. Now, there is room for an argument that says they are on board and might be at the back of the bus. There might be an argument that say they have repositioned themselves at the front of the bus. It is for you to determine where they are in relation to the locomotive. But what we do know is that there is a window of time in which they have come on the bus, And this is significant because governments are in possession of considerable resources. Governments are elected by the people to reflect their best interests. And this is an initiative that we hope can be sustained, and the length to which it is sustained will depend, I think, upon everything that we do or do not do. So that is how I see this moment. Many of you here have been involved in this struggle long before this initiative and will continue long after this initiative. So that is the first point I wish to make. Then I wish to speak about the mechanics and the technicalities of this initiative insofar as we now are working with and through a Prime Ministerial Subcommittee. This Prime Ministerial Subcommittee is the committee that we are expected to report to and to engage and to inform. So there is a CARICOM Commission that is mandated to interact with a Prime Ministerial Subcommittee and to reflect the mandate of that subcommittee. Effectively then, we are speaking about a narrow perspective of conversation and of reporting, but this is the nature of the experiment that we are engaged in. The Prime Ministerial Subcommittee, in its last meeting, made 3 significant statements. One, they have argued that before the governments of CARICOM take the historic and seminal step to engage the governments of the slave-owning countries at a higher level of intergovernmental diplomacy, that there are certain steps that they would wish us to take. One, they would wish us to organize an international academic conference on this subject. The reason being that they are not yet satisfied that the region and its complexity is fully on board with this reparatory justice movement. We know that grassroots organizations have been pushing for this for over a century. But there is still a belief that, if you may say, the bulk of the professional community of this region is not yet on board. This conference that takes as a design an expert formulation, that is, that we have brought colleagues from all of the professional disciplines to engage with the grassroots organizations that represent the infrastructure and the historical infrastructure of the movement, is an attempt to widen that conversation, to bring on board voices from our medical practitioners, our theologians, our economists, our media, our artists, all of those groups that constitute society, to build a popular front. This is part of this initiative. The Prime Ministerial Subcommittee is asked us to take one further step and to organize a research conference where all of the questions that are pertinent to reparatory justice are thoroughly researched, thoroughly documented, and made available for public dissemination. They believe that this is an important step that has to be taken. In many respects, there would be considerable sympathy for this. For example, it it is hardly known throughout the Caribbean and the black community generally that when the emancipation models, the models that were pushed through right across the world to emancipate the Africans, that in each of those models passed by the European Parliament, the enslaved Africans were asked to pay for more than 50% of the cost of their own emancipation. That point is hardly known. These are things that are buried in the suppression of history, and the view is that all of this information needs to be brought to the fore urgently and critically. On the issue of the British model, and it's the same for the Dutch and the Spanish, first of all, you have the rhetoric, you have the great speeches. You have abolitionists, the Wilberforce, shall share, all of the abolitionists who you know, go into Parliament and they make great speeches about freedom, justice, liberty. But then the Parliament would send the matter to committee for discussion. It is now sent into subcommittee for formulation. It is in the subcommittee that the details of the emancipation plan are then worked out. And in the case of the British model, the British subcommittees determined that the value of the Africans, the value of the enslaved Africans, was £47 million. The state decided that it could afford no more than 20 million of that 47 to pay over to the slaveholders. The question was then asked, who would pay the balance? Because the legislation was going to be based on the principle that all property holders have a legal right to fair and just compensation for the loss of their property. And the Parliament has to respond to that. So the Parliament says, the taxpayers will pay 20 million, we will raise a bond on the money market, raise that 20 million, and hand that over to the slaveholders. But the enslaved must pay the balance. And how do you do that? You need to formulate a mechanism, and this is where the work of the subcommittees become important, where the numbers are crunched. This is not in the Parliament now where the grand speeches are being made. This is in the committee where the calculations are being made to come back to the Parliament. That the only way to recoup the 27 million was that the enslaved would have to work for free for a specified number of years, whether it is 10, 8, 6, or 4 years. And that was the British model. Ultimately, 6 years, you are free, but you have to work for free for another 6 years to allow your owners to recoup the 27 million of value. In the end, when the numbers are calculated, the enslaved end up paying 53% of the financial cost of their own freedom. This was the same right across the European models. This was the model. So when the British and the French and all the rest of them make grand statements about freeing the blacks, they are being dishonest, they are being disingenuous, and they have succeeded in winning a moral and intellectual victory for over 150 years by suppressing the facts of the case. What we have to do is to expose the lies and the dishonesties and the untruths and put the facts on the table. Just put the facts on the table. That the British model, the French, Dutch, the Portuguese, they were an absolute shame and disgrace given the language that they have used about carrying through into the world a wave of freedom. And the conference will have to bring out all of this information. This expert panels will begin that process. It needs to be brought fully out so that the world can understand the travesty of the injustice of the emancipation legislations. They have also asked that we establish an inter-university institute. There are so many universities across the Caribbean within the CARICOM community. These universities are asked to collaborate and establish a research institute that will drive this quality research so that we do not have to be dependent upon false and incorrect research that has dominated this conversation for over 100 years. But while this work has been going on, within the specific remit of this commission, the reparatory justice movement has been galloping around the world on multiple fronts. And I think we ought to, for example, congratulate for the Glenroy Watson, who was here, for organizing that massive rally in the city of London. And you ought to go on the YouTube and see the London rally, massive rally of all kinds of people marching through London into the quarters of government, bringing awareness and making demands. And this is just the beginning, no doubt. This is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. Some of you are probably already aware that Minister Farrakhan is going to make a major speech in Jamaica on the 19th of October, which is next week, at the National Arena. He was hoping to organize a Caribbean tour celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Million Woman Man March, which was done in Washington. And he wanted to bring that process to the Caribbean. No doubt, I do not have all the details, and maybe David Comachon can intervene at some critical moment and speak more to it. I think he knows more than I do on this. That is going to be, no doubt, a very significant historic movement, a moment in the global reparatory justice movement. There were opportunities to address the Congressional Black Caucus a few weeks ago in Washington. And Minister Gonzalez, the son of Prime Minister Gonzalez, and myself were given the opportunity to speak to the caucus. Mr. Don Rojas is here. He was a critical part of that. I don't know why he's hiding in the back. Oh, he's filming away. And it was an extraordinary intervention. Many of you would have read that fascinating article by what's the name? The gentleman?
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Ta-Nehisi.
What's the first name?
Ta-Nehisi.
Ta-Nehisi Coates. In the Atlantic. We were able to share a platform with him. The critical thing is that he is part of a younger generation of scholars who are coming to this movement, instinctively coming to this movement, like many of you young scholars coming to make a contribution. And his thesis is innovative. He merely argues that the most effective way to understand the chattelization of African peoples is to see it as a process of economic extraction. To see the globalization and the commodification of black people as a process of extraction, whereby economic value and worth is extracted out of a people to be accumulated for reinvestments for development in other places. And that is the driving force why the process went on for 300, 400, 500 years. It was a highly organized system of extraction. And you can measure, he argued, you can measure at every moment using simple economic methodologies the process and the extent of that extraction of wealth out of a people to be used for reinvestments by other people. And that framework is very compelling. One of the conclusions he drew was that if you take it to the present time, in the USA, for example, for every $100, that exists within the economy, the black community owns just $2. For every $100, the black community owns and possesses $2 of every 100. And this is after 300 years of extraction. And the process, he argues, continues. It's a continual process of extraction. Didn't end with emancipation. It galloped after emancipation, gained strength in the 20th century. And he showed how the movement of African peoples out of the plantations of the South into the cities, into the urban complex, allowed urbanization and industrialization to take place, cheap labor from the South coming to the North, driving industrial development, allowing for accumulation, another 100 years of extraction. And this is quite impressive, I think, for a young man to have worked this out so skillfully and to present such a compelling narrative. In the Congressional Caucus conversation, we resolve that the Americans will establish a National Commission on Reparations. This is very important, very significant, because as you all know, in the USA there's a plenitude, a multitude of organizations. The proposal is that they will all come together and form a national commission, and that this commission will be launched sometime in the early new year in a joint sitting with us, so that we will have a USA Caribbean sitting. And by then, we are hoping that our brothers and sisters in Brazil will have put together their commission. Then we can have a North American, Caribbean, Brazilian commission meeting. And these are some of the strategies that we are pushing through beyond the specific work of our commission. But the critical posture adopted by the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee is one that still haunts us. There is still considerable pushback in the black communities on this question. We are still experiencing a headwind in our own communities in respect to this question. In other words, despite all of the work that has been done in the last 100 years or so, we have not yet won the case. We have not yet won our own case. Even before we can present the case to the oppressors, we have not won the case yet among ourselves. And that is the concrete reality of the moment. And the political leaders, quite understandably, are aware of this. What are we going to do to win the case in our own communities, beyond our own organizations, and a broader section of the community? how are we going to broaden the base and create a popular front? Well, there are two ways. Excuse me. I think this is the Prime Minister Patterson. Excuse me a second. Hello? Hello? Oh, you're there. Okay. Good. Are you at the reception area? Oh, you're on the outside. Oh, we will come outside and get you. Okay. Good. Good. Thanks, Dory. I can turn my phone up. I was waiting for my phone. Okay, how are we going to win the case within our own community? What new and innovative strategies? All of you in this room have dedicated your lives. And all of you here are also aware that we have not yet reached where we want to reach. A question can be asked, is there a need to? Thank you. So the question remains then, how do we broaden the base of our efforts, given that we recognize this reluctance? Last night, we would have heard from Prime Minister Patterson speaking about the mythology of the African complicity. But the importance of making that argument is precisely because that argument was used in 100 years to keep African governments on the back foot. Many African governments have been reluctant to step forward because of the veracity of this argument. And the role of academics in this regard is not only to destabilize those arguments, but to reject those arguments so as to create political space for a new form of intervention. We have students, for example, who are researching the origins of the European slave trade in West Africa. The construction of the forts at Elmina, at Cape Coast, these forts that dot across the West African coast like sentinels. And one of the important pieces of research which we are hoping to bring here in the near future is a documentation of the number of political assassinations of African leaders during the context of the slave trade. Those African leaders who stood against the slave trade, who mobilized their communities against the slave trade, how the companies, the Royal African Company, the British Company, the Dutch West Indian Company, would issue instructions to assassinate those leaders. And we have that documentation in their own records of instructions given to assassinate West African leaders who stood in the way of the slave trade. And if you examine the political boundaries of West Africa in the 16th century, and then you examine those political boundaries in the 18th century, the boundaries have been redrawn. And they are redrawn precisely because those states that stood in opposition were destroyed. Those states that partnered for a short period were militarily empowered. And remember this, again, the academic evidence which we have to bring to the table, that Europe's principal export to West Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries were guns. Guns were the principal, by far, the leading export of West Africa, of Western Europe into West Africa in the 200 years of the slave trade. So what you're speaking about is not just the organization of massive companies to go into West Africa, intimidate governments, overthrow governments, assassinate leaders, but to militarize those communities. To militarize those communities. And that is why I have always said there are some very striking similarities between the slave trade and the narcotics trade. There's some very striking similarities between the slave trade and the narcotics trade. Because those companies, such as the Royal African Company and the Dutch West Indian Company, no West African government had the resources available to them compared with what these large corporations had available to them. And there are many small black states in the world that don't have the resources of drug cartels. The similarities are very, very striking. And the militarization of the narcotics trade through the relations of weaponry, the same process we saw with the slave trade. The weaponization of West Africa as a standard commercial operation turning West Africa into a bloodbath. And it became a bloodbath that then spawned a slave trade. And the two go side by side, hand in hand. And this is why all of this evidence has to be brought out, documented, so that our political leaders will then be empowered with all of the relevant data needed to construct their arguments. And so we have to win the conversation. We have to win the conversation. The UN has declared 2015, 2025 a decade in celebration and in memory of the journey of the African diaspora communities. This creates a context and a framework within which we can then operate. But again, it is going to be the interaction between civil society movements and the CARICOM initiative. It is this interaction that will give us the energy that we need. This commission cannot carry the leadership of the reparatory justice movement. The commission cannot do it. The commission can be like the yeast that will enable the cake to rise, but it can only be that. All of those civil society organizations have to continue with their work, their energy, their efforts. We will interact with each other, cross-fertilize, feed into each other to create the energy that is required, A, to win the debate and to broaden the base of participation. This is what we call the skill of movement building. But bear in mind, as Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it happens. And therefore, the concept of despair, the concept of imagining the impossibility of an achievement should be banished from your consciousness. Because when history begins to move, it moves. When it begins to move, it moves, and it moves with a logic and a pace and a rhythm. And quite often, many of us are left flat-footed when it does. And I have no doubt in my mind that a time is going to come in the very near future, in this decade, that this process will reach a boiling point and it will unravel and it will move. The 10-point plan has to be worked through in greater detail. It was just the beginning of the framing of the conversation. And the reason why we placed that 10-point plan on the table for consideration was because we recognize that to a large extent, the reparatory justice movement has within its bosom multiple interpretations of what reparations ought to be. Almost each organization within the movement has a perception of the methodology and the objectives of reparatory justice. And so, therefore, there is a proliferation of thoughts on strategies and methods. And on the one hand, this might be a very good thing. It might be a very good thing because certainly what it does is to reflect the complexity of our own minds and consciousness. But at the same time, we have to possess the skill to know when to go forward with a strategy, when to pull back with a strategy, and when to interlock other objectives. My own sense then is that we have reached a stage where tactics and strategies are now desperately required. Desperately required. The governments of CARICOM have given us a leg up. Their intervention has energized this movement. It is up to the civil societies group to take that energy and move forward persuasively into the next era. And so then I conclude by saying that let not your heart be troubled. Do not become a victim of the impossibility theory, the not in my lifetime theory. And this is something, when I had that wonderful moment, just 19 minutes, and I counted every minute, and I savored those 19 minutes. 19 minutes with Mr. Mandela. And one of the things he said in response to a question which I asked, remember that African people have a very different sense of time. A very different sense of time. We might very well have the long view of time. The long view of time. We ought not to suffer the anxiety of the moment, that we have anxiety attacks, that nothing is happening, and we get anxious, and when we get anxious, we get disillusioned. And we get disillusioned and we walk away, and then we tell our children nothing is going to happen, not in our lifetime. I remember when Ian Smith came on British television, and I was a teenager, and he said, not in my lifetime will Africans run this country. 3 years later, Mugabe was the Prime Minister. Because the not in our lifetime is their time. We have a different rhythm of time, and we know that we are going forward steadfastly. So prepare yourselves. Do not be engaging and wasting your energies with the impossibility argument. Maintain your focus. Build your base. Strengthen your organizations. And be guided by the principle of the rightness of what you are doing. The rightness of what you're doing. You will be surrounded by those who are driven by pragmatism, those who are driven by more complex sense of self-interest. You are moving forward the history of the world. Move it forward steadily. It will unravel. Of that I have no doubt. And I thank you very much for the generosity of your attention.